They are ghosts without names, warriors without graves, sons cast into shadow by the very Father who forged a galaxy in fire and blood. In the vast annals of the Imperium's sacred history, 2 entire legions, the Siku and the Elivitin, have been expunged so completely that even their mention is heresy, their existence reduced to empty numerals and haunting absences in the official roll of the primarchs. They are not remembered, they are unremembered. And yet, their silence screams louder than any loyalist ode or traitor's curse. To erase history in the Imperium is no simple thing. Memory is power, sacred, weaponized, and fiercely guarded. So what transgression could demand such annihilation? What horror did these legions unleash, or what forbidden truth did they uncover that not even martyrdom could sanctify them? Their fate is not merely a loss. It is a wound, deliberately infected and kept festering to conceal something far worse. Today, we tear away the veil of sanctioned ignorance and plunge into the darkness the Imperium desperately wishes we would forget. The Emperor was never a man given to sentiment, yet there are moments in Imperial history where the weight of emotion, of regret, of wrath, of sorrow presses through the cracks in his divine silence. The Lost Legions are one such fracture, to erase not merely names, but every record, every memorial, every whispered tale, is not the act of a being unconcerned. It is the desperate, deliberate purge of someone for whom the past has become unbearable. For all his magnificence, the Emperor was still fallible, still burdened by the impossible calculus of empire building. In the deaths, not just physical but spiritual, of the 2 and Evant legions, we glimpse the hidden price of his ambition. What if these forgotten sons were not traitors, but reminders of a failed philosophy, of a frayed bond, of choices made in the infancy of the Imperium that grew too monstrous to tolerate? The Great Crusade was not a clean conquest. It was a seething ocean of war, compromise, and paradox. Perhaps the Lost Legions were early warning signs, beacons that lit too brightly and exposed the contradictions at the heart of the imperial truth. To some, this is heresy. To others, it is prophecy. For what greater failure could the master of mankind admit than the failure of his own children, not through corruption or rebellion, but by the raw, devastating realization that their ideals could not survive the very world he created for them? There is a grim poetry in the possibility that the Emperor did not destroy the Lost Legions for what they did, but for what they meant. If they questioned the imperial truth, or refused to bow to the cold calculus of unity through annihilation, then they were a mirror held up to their creator's darkest flaws. Perhaps they pleaded for diplomacy with Xenos. Perhaps they rejected the destruction of cultures too beautiful to be absorbed. Perhaps they refused the brutalist standardization demanded of them. And in doing so, they revealed that the Imperium was not built upon truth, but upon conformity masquerading as destiny. Their erasure was not to protect the Imperium from contamination. It was to shield it from introspection. Consider the psychological weight of such a decision. The Emperor, whose every act was meant to lead humanity toward transcendence, choosing to obliterate part of his legacy not out of necessity, but shame. In a galaxy where every dead guardsman is immortalized as a martyr, where even the most fallen primarchs are remembered in damnation, what does it say that these 2 sons earned only silence? It is almost easier to believe they turned to chaos, for at least that is a narrative the Imperium understands and can weaponize. But to believe that they simply defied a part of the Emperor he could not bear to confront, that is terrifying. If they had committed atrocities, they would be vilified. If they had succeeded too well, they would be lionized. But they were not either. They were forgotten. They were burned out of every transcript, their memory salted and scattered. That kind of erasure speaks not of punishment, but of protection. Not for them, but for the fragile, unspoken truths at the heart of the Emperor's dream. The kind of truths that might make even demigods question their creator and make humanity recoil from the myth of its own divine destiny. They were brothers once, no different in origin than the others scattered across the stars by the ruinous winds of the warp. Yet while the names of Horus, Guilliman, Russ, and the rest thunder across the ages, the primarchs of the Seku and Edefefin legions are spectral enigmas, severed from the tapestry of imperial myth. But the warp never forgets. In the silence where their names should be, countless theories have bloomed like forbidden flowers, each one whispering a different truth, or perhaps a different lie, about what kind of men they were. Some believe one was a pacifist, a brilliant tactician who sought to win worlds through diplomacy and cultural unity rather than extermination. A primarch who might have seen the Great Crusade not as a holy war, but a philosophical mission. That would make him anathema to the dogmatic machinery the Imperium would become. Others envision a brother whose mind was too flexible, too open, who questioned the Emperor's decrees not out of rebellion, but out of logic. A child who, like Magnus, sought truth through forbidden means, not the warp perhaps, but alien wisdom, lost technologies, or even proto-AI relics. Such intellect could be deemed dangerously heretical by the rigid vision of imperial truth. The other? Perhaps he was a monster, not in the way Angron was broken, but in the way Conrad Kurza was prophetic. A primarch who saw too clearly, who understood the Imperium's future cruelty and chose to burn everything in protest. Not a traitor in the conventional sense, but a martyr to a higher morality. Or maybe he was perfection incarnate, so successful, so beloved, that he threatened the ideological balance of the primarchs themselves. What if one of the lost primarchs achieved a unification more profound than Guilliman's logistics or Horus's charisma, forging a proto-imperium that outshone Terra's cold centralism? There are more sinister whispers too. Theories of genetic instability. Perhaps one of the primarchs was too close to the Emperor, born not merely of gene laboratories, but infused with the Old One's forgotten knowledge or the stolen power of the Dragon of Mars. Others say they dabbled in the same dangerous paths that led to the Horus heresy, but did so far earlier and were struck down before they could spread their ideas. What if they were not purged for failing, but for succeeding in creating something else, something independent, something dangerously free? Yet even among such speculation, a more chilling possibility persists, that the primarchs of the Lost Legions weren't erased for their deeds, but for their potential. The Emperor saw in them a destiny divergent from his grand design, and feared what they might become. In that fear, he chose to unmake them, not to kill, but to unwrite, not to punish, but to disappear. No trial, no execution, just silence. And within that silence lies the unbearable truth, that the Emperor, whose every primarch was a fragment of his will, could not accept even the idea of a legacy beyond his control. The lost primarchs may have been the most human of his sons. Too human. And in their humanity, they mirrored back to him the unbearable possibility that the future did not belong to the gods of war, but to the mortals who dared dream otherwise. The Great Crusade was a war of unity, but not one without scars. For all the triumphs sung by remembrancers and carved into cathedral walls, there are shadowed battles no one speaks of, campaigns marked by strategic brilliance and sudden silence. The Seku and Event legions, it is whispered, were there, not merely as footnotes or auxiliaries, but as architects of victory whose names were later chiseled off monuments. Their deeds erased not because they failed, but because they succeeded in ways that no longer aligned with imperial doctrine. Consider the Black Sentinels of the Valorn Cluster, a campaign remembered only in passing, where entire planetary systems surrendered without a shot fired. Official histories attribute it to Guilliman's diplomacy, but conflicting fragmentary logs suggest the presence of another force, one employing psychological warfare and mass holography, tactics far beyond the known capacities of any legion. The strategy was too clean, too humane, too unimperial. And perhaps that was the sin. Perhaps the Lost Legion in command won the war without blood, and in doing so made the rest of the legions look like butchers. Other stories are more visceral. The doom of Chthonia's moon, where orbital cities were turned inside out by a force that moved faster than Vox recordings could capture. The Luna Wolves claim it as one of their early victories, yet battle sigils in ancient vaults hint at a different icon, a stylized Ouroboros encircling a dying star. No legion bears such a mark now. Perhaps none ever will again. There are suggestions that entire war zones were handed over to these lost legions when diplomacy or innovation was required, and just as swiftly reclaimed when the methods proved ideologically inconvenient. It is said the 11th Legion once held the eastern fringe alone for nearly 3 years, maintaining stability with autonomous governance councils and citizen militias trained by Astartes instructors. A utopia of discipline, logic, and local sovereignty. The High Lords would never permit such heresy today. Even then, it may have been too much freedom, too much evolution beyond the Emperor's singular vision. Guilliman might have admired it. Dorn might have hated it. But above all, it showed that the dream of human unity didn't need to be drenched in blood. It just needed faith in humanity itself, a faith the Imperium has never truly had. These scars exist in more than whispers. There are battle brothers of ancient chapters whose gene seed diverges too far from any known line, carrying traits that match no loyalist or traitor primarch. Inquisitorial edicts brand these anomalies as mutations or contamination, but that is a convenient excuse. The truth may be buried in wars no one remembers, where these gene lines were earned in the service of a forgotten standard. And then there are the ruins. Tombs with no names, statues decapitated, not by time, but by intention. Murals scraped blank, save for the edges of helms and pauldrons that do not match any known heraldry. When these artifacts are uncovered, the response is always the same: silence, followed by disappearance. The Ordo Redactus does not ask questions. It erases the possibility of the question ever existing. If the lost legions had merely failed, they would have been remembered as cautionary tales. But their ghost victories tell another story, that they triumphed, that they built something enduring, and that those triumphs were not celebrated, but feared. In that fear, the Imperium chose obliteration over contradiction. It is not only treason the Imperium punishes. It is the heresy of success without permission. The Council of Nicaea is remembered as the moment the Emperor attempted to impose clarity on the dangerous ambiguity of psychers among the Astartes. Magnus stood trial, and the Librarius program was all but dismantled. Yet there are lingering suspicions, whispers in the Librarium Sanctus and the echoing vaults of the Black Ships, that this was not the first such trial. That before Magnus, before the Thousand Sons became the cautionary tale of psychic excess, there was another reckoning. One that ended not in exile or limitation, but in obliteration, and the defendants, the Isku and Ephanes legions. Some theorists suggest that the Nicaean precedent was born from a deeper, more catastrophic failure, an earlier encounter with the warp not yet tempered by knowledge or restraint. What if one of the lost legions not only embraced psychic power, but sought to integrate it into the very structure of their warfare and governance? What if their primarch was not simply a powerful psyker, but a visionary who saw the warp not as a threat, but as a tool to elevate humanity itself? A child of the Emperor who dared to accelerate the species toward its psychic potential, heedless of the Immaterium's predatory hunger. The Emperor, for all his transcendent ambition, feared the warp deeply. His Webway project was, at its heart, a bulwark against chaos, a way to circumvent the need for warp travel entirely. So imagine his horror if one of his sons decided that, instead of fleeing the warp, humanity should master it. Not cautiously, like the Thousand Sons, not dogmatically, like the Navigators or Astropaths, but fully. A legion of post-humans merging with the warp, becoming more than Astartes, becoming something else, the psychic apotheosis of mankind, uncontrolled, unapproved, and unstoppable. Perhaps it was not just one legion, perhaps both, a convergence of philosophies deemed too volatile to coexist. One primarch arguing for psychic evolution, the other for technological resurrection, two poles of heretical thought dragging the Imperium toward a singularity it was not ready to confront. Nicaea might have been the Emperor's attempt to ensure that history did not repeat itself. A reassertion of control, of psychic suppression, to guarantee that no legion could ever again walk the same path the lost legions once did. There are echoes in the testimonies of Nicaea. Some of the Emperor's arguments seem rehearsed, weary, as if he had spoken them before, to sons now dust. The vehemence with which certain primarchs attacked the Librarius, particularly Leman Russ and Rogel Dorn, feels too intense for first-time outrage. Could they have seen firsthand the consequences of unrestrained psychic power in the hands of their brothers? Could their rage be born not from theory, but from memory? And what of Malcador? The Sigillite, ever silent, ever watchful, bears a look in the few surviving visual records of Nicaea, a haunted solemnity that suggests he too was reliving an older trauma. The way he defends the Emperor's judgment is not just conviction, it is fear. Not of the Thousand Sons, but of ghosts long buried. In this light, the Council of Nicaea becomes a shadow play, a reenactment of a forgotten trial, one whose verdict was not a restriction, but a purge. If the Seku or Ephun legions were sacrificed to prevent a psychic cataclysm, then Nicaea was not justice. It was damage control. The erasure of the lost legions becomes not just a tragedy, but a warning etched in blood and flame, never again. In a galaxy as complex and secretive as the Imperium, nothing is ever truly destroyed, only repurposed. The idea that the Seku and Ephthyn legions vanished without leaving residue is not only improbable, it's a lie in motion, a lie wrapped in silver ceramite and cloaked in inquisitorial robes. What if the ashes of the lost legions weren't scattered, but smelted into new forms? What if their warriors, their tactics, their very gene seed found new homes in the quiet corners of the Imperium, hiding in plain sight? Consider the Grey Knights, mysterious, potent, and utterly unique. A chapter that seems too perfect, too secretive, to be the result of standard Imperial science. Their psychic prowess surpasses that of any other force in the Imperium, even the Thousand Sons at their peak. Their origins are hidden beneath layers of misdirection and classified redactions. What if the Grey Knights are not merely a creation of Malcador and the Emperor, but the refined legacy of one of the lost legions? The best and most psychically stable warriors culled from a fallen legion, remade into something the Imperium could control. Not a chapter born of faith, but of necessity. Not founded, extracted. And what of the Inquisition? The Ordo Redactus, in particular, deals specifically with the erasure of knowledge, a seemingly minor division, yet wielding almost unlimited authority when it comes to historical revisionism. Who trains them? Who guides their methods? Some say it is the High Lords or the Officio Assassinorum. Others whisper that veterans of the Ephthynth Legion walk among them still, no longer warriors, but archivists of absence, sculptors of oblivion. Their battlefield now the memory of humanity itself. There are tales, too, of certain Astartes chapters with curiously undocumented lineages. The exorcists, for instance, who undergo demonic possession as part of their training. Their tolerance for warp exposure is unparalleled, too unparalleled. Their gene seed remains oddly pure despite such rituals. What if they, too, are inheritors of forbidden bloodlines, fragments of a legion bred for warp warfare and then buried under layers of misdirection? Even the Death Watch, with their cryptic operations and pan-chapter recruitment, sometimes field warriors who speak in tongues no living Astartes recognizes, rituals and war cries echoing from a past that officially never was. Traitor legions may carry hints as well. Before their damnation, they fought alongside brothers long forgotten. What if elements of the Seku and Ephthynth legions were absorbed during the early Crusade years, splintered and adopted by the likes of the Alpha Legion or the Word-Bearers? Remnants, echoes, even rivalries that predate the heresy. Imagine a warrior of the Lost Legion's awakening to find his cause erased, his primarch gone, his name forbidden. What choice would he have but to hide or to rage? The Adeptus Mechanicus, too, may play a part. There are rumors of sealed vaults on Mars, hidden beneath Noctis Labyrinthus, containing gene seed not registered in any known database. Seed with anomalous traits, enhanced cognition, advanced empathy, even limited psychic resonance. Some believe these were meant for a different kind of Astartes, warriors of diplomacy and psychic finesse rather than raw aggression. Rejected not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well in paths the Emperor later deemed dangerous. And then there are the whispers of Astartes who do not wear any known heraldry, who operate in the dark void between segmenti. Rogue assets, silent task forces. Perhaps they are the last loyalists of the Lost Legions, still fighting a war that has no name, answering only to a mission the Imperium has long disowned. Not traitors, not loyalists, just forgotten. The Imperium may have tried to erase them, but no system is perfect. No fire burns hot enough to consume legacy entirely. Somewhere in the blood, in the data, in the rituals and strategies that make the Imperium function, pieces of the Lost Legions endure. Legion within legion, memory within silence. And one day, that silence may speak. It is often said that the primarchs were not just generals, but symbols, the ideological cornerstones of the Imperium. Each was meant to embody a specific virtue, a facet of the Emperor's divine design. Yet even among brothers forged for unity, there were fractures, rivalries, suspicions, even outright loathing. And nothing magnified those tensions like the sudden, brutal absence of the Tku and Davon. Their erasure didn't just cleanse the records. It broke the psychological cohesion of the remaining sons. Imagine being Roboute Guilliman, architect of empire, obsessed with order and record. What would it do to a mind like his to have entire pages of history redacted, not by accident, but by command, by his father? The cold precision of the Ultramarines would find no comfort in sanctioned silence. Guilliman's relationship with truth, with legacy, would be forever tainted by the realization that even memory could be a tool of war. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, wore his loyalty as a beast wears its fangs. His hatred of heresy was primal, but so too was his memory. If he fought beside the Lost Legions, and it is all but certain that he did, then their destruction wasn't just a strategic adjustment, it was personal. Perhaps he mourned them. Perhaps he hunted them. Perhaps he did both. Russ's fury was always more than genetic. It was grief forged into purpose. What if his reputation as the Emperor's executioner was sealed not at Prospero, but in the ashes of one of his brother's worlds? And Horus. Oh, Horus, the favored son. What did he lose when the Saku and Ephemts were wiped away? It is often said that his descent into rebellion was fueled by pride and betrayal. But what if something deeper gnawed at him? What if he had once fought alongside one of the lost primarchs, loved him like a brother, only to see him vanish, not to treason, but to nothingness? The grief, the confusion, the sense that his father could erase anyone, even his own children, without explanation. Such revelations may have sown seeds of resentment long before chaos ever whispered in his ear. Even the more stoic primarchs would not have emerged untouched. Vulcan, bearer of compassion, might have seen the purge as a moral abomination. Ferrus Manus, obsessed with strength and failure, might have viewed the destruction of 2 legions as a proof of flaw in the Emperor's design. Mortarion, ever resentful of secrecy and privilege, would have raged at the silence. Even Rogel Dorn, for all his stoicism, might have cracked just a little under the strain of being told to forget what was once sacred. The emotional aftermath was never healed. There are implications in their behavior, in their writings, subtle absences where names should be, hesitations in speech, patterns of loyalty warped by old unspoken wounds. The primarchs were not automatons. They felt, they remembered, and they were forced to endure the cognitive dissonance of having fought beside brothers who no longer existed, who must not be spoken of. That kind of silence is not peace. It is trauma calcified into ritual. It shaped the culture of their legions, too. The mysterious reluctance some Astartes have toward discussing early Crusade years. the veiled references in older chapter rituals to the lost brethren or the silence before the storm. These are not accidents. They are scars, spiritual and mental, left by a betrayal none were allowed to grieve. And perhaps that was the true purpose, to sever not just records but relationships, to make the primarchs more isolated, more dependent on the Emperor, less likely to unite without his direction, divide and rule, break the emotional bonds and leave only professional allegiance. But it failed. It failed because they were not tools. They were sons. And sons do not forget their brothers no matter what the record says. The assumption, ever convenient to the ecclesiarchy and inquisition alike, is that if a legion is erased, it must have succumbed to chaos. But this is a projection, a narrative neatly aligned with the Imperium's moral geometry. Traitors are remembered to be condemned. Heretics are immortalized in damnation. The lost legions, however, are not condemned. They are absent. And this absence suggests a more disturbing truth. Perhaps they did not fall to chaos at all, but to something worse. What if the Seku and F-Hound legions broke away not because of seduction by the ruinous powers, but because they embraced a rival vision for humanity's future? One that rejected the Imperium's rigid orthodoxy, not for corruption, but for clarity. A vision where artificial intelligence, long outlawed as abominable, was not feared but embraced. Not crude thinking machines, but true symbiotic partnerships, techno-savant constructs working alongside post-human warriors in perfect harmony. Such a fusion would be an existential threat to the Mechanicum's priesthood, who fear anything that undermines their monopoly on sanctioned knowledge. Or perhaps the lost legions made peace with the Xenos. Not subjugation, not extermination, but peace. They might have forged alliances with Eldar Exodites, learned from Tau philosophies, even bartered with Necron dynasties for relics of impossible power. Imagine a legion that refused to annihilate every alien it encountered, and instead sought synthesis, diplomacy, exchange. That would be heresy of the highest order, not just a deviation from the Emperor's plan, a refutation of it. Even more chilling is the idea that the lost legions might have turned their gaze inward, that they became philosophers, visionaries, revolutionaries, that they looked at the Imperium they were helping to build, with its genocide, its cultural sterilization, its cold hierarchies, and said no, not as traitors, but as idealists, not seeking to destroy the Imperium, but to save it from itself. In their eyes, the true corruption wasn't chaos. It was compliance. Such dissent is more dangerous than any demonic incursion. Chaos can be blamed. But philosophical rebellion? That seeds doubt. That breeds sympathy. It cannot be demonized as easily, and so it must be buried utterly. No records, no accusations, no memory, just silence. That is how you kill an idea. Not with fire, but with forgetting. There's another, stranger theory, that the lost legions didn't fall at all, that they ascended, that they reached a form of post-human transcendence the Emperor did not anticipate, perhaps even feared. Imagine a legion that discovered how to shed its flesh and upload its essence into a warp-proof matrix of consciousness, a legion of ghosts who could never be possessed, never be tempted, never be controlled. Beings who existed beyond matter, beyond death. The Emperor may have realized too late that they were becoming not his weapons, but his equals. And what if their crime was neither fall nor flight, but refusal? Refusal to comply, refusal to conquer, refusal to murder innocent civilizations in the name of unity. A legion that looked into the future of the Imperium and chose death over participation. The Emperor could tolerate traitors. He could even redeem them. But he could not afford martyrs of conscience. Better to erase them entirely than risk the galaxy remembering that even the Emperor's sons could say no. In this light, the silence surrounding the Seku and 15th legions becomes not a shameful omission, but an ideological firewall. Their true fate, whatever it was, must have contradicted the very foundation of the Imperium. Whether they joined Xenos, birthed AI, rejected the Crusade, or transcended flesh, they did something that cannot be allowed to exist within the myth of the Emperor's infallibility. That myth must be unbroken. And so they were broken instead. They stand like golden statues, unmoving and impassive, the Adeptus Custodes, warriors who were never Astartes, guardians who answer only to the Emperor himself. Yet their silence speaks volumes, for if anyone remembers the lost legions, it is they. The Custodes were there at the beginning. They saw the Great Crusade's first sparks ignite. They watched the primarchs grow, and they would have witnessed firsthand the fall or obliteration of the Tu and Ephythen. Their lips are sealed not by ignorance but by decree. Among the most arcane duties of the Custodes is not merely the defense of the Emperor's flesh, but of his intent. They are enforcers of interpretation, curators of what should be remembered. While the Inquisition excises heresy from without, the Custodes excise heresy from within, from history, from meaning, from legacy. There are those who suspect that when the Emperor declared the lost legions erased, it was not the Inquisition that carried out the purge. It was the 10,000, walking silently through Libraria and Cogitator banks, deleting, burning, and redacting with godlike precision. If so, what secrets do they carry still? What truths do they bury beneath the marble halls of the Imperial Palace? It is said some Custodes walk the Tower of Hegemon alone for centuries, pondering decisions made 10,000 years ago. Perhaps among them is one who held the blade to a brother legion's throat. Perhaps another stood as witness while a primarch was unmade. Not killed, not exiled, unmade. For only the Custodes possess the loyalty, the power, and the lack of doubt necessary to carry out such an order. There are darker rumors that the vaults of the Custodes, those forbidden depths beneath the palace, hold not just relics, but remains. Trophies from a war the Imperium cannot acknowledge. Gene seed samples, ceremonial blades, a cracked helm still bearing an unknown sigil. These artifacts are not displayed, not studied. They are kept like curses. To open those vaults would be to invite madness, for they hold the proof that the Emperor's will is not perfect, that even demigods can be failures. And it is not merely the Custodes' silence that condemns them, but their actions. Their refusal to acknowledge certain records, their sudden interventions in the most obscure archaeotech digs, their quiet presence during certain inquisitorial purges. There is a pattern too intricate to be accidental. Wherever remnants of the lost legions might surface, whether genetic, historical, or spiritual, the Custodes are not far behind. They do not explain. They do not justify. They simply act. One might wonder then what price they have paid. For memory is a weapon, but it is also a wound. What burden does it place upon a being of such purity to know that two of their master's sons were obliterated not because they fell, but because they refused? How does one guard a throne whose architect could not accept contradiction? Perhaps this is why the Custodes stand so still, not out of stoicism, but out of grief too ancient to name. In a galaxy of war and dogma, the Custodes are considered incorruptible. Yet incorruptibility does not mean untroubled. If they are the last keepers of the truth of the lost legions, then they are also its final prisoners. They cannot speak. They cannot mourn. They can only remember, perfectly and forever, the moment the Imperium chose to forget. Censorship in the Imperium is not a matter of erasure alone. It is an art form honed over millennia. The obliteration of the Secu and Ephythen legions was not a simple deletion. It was a campaign, a total and systematic unmaking, carried out with the same precision the legions once brought to planetary conquest. It was not enough to silence their names. Their meaning had to be destroyed. The methods by which this was achieved are as terrifying as they are effective, revealing the true machinery of memory control in the Imperium. First, there is the mind wipe, not of data, but of people. Servitors are routinely lobotomized, but inquisitorial records suggest the use of more subtle psychoneural reformatting on high-ranking Astartes, commanders, and even primarchs. Whole cadres of officers from the early Great Crusade vanished not from the battlefield, but from themselves. Memory excised through psychic surgery, leaving only shadows of loyalty with no origin. It is not that they forgot the lost legions. It is that they never knew them at all. Then comes data purging. The Ordo Redactus operates like a scalpel dipped in acid. Its agents do not merely redact documents. They alter context, rewrite histories, and in some cases fabricate entirely new narratives to mask the absence. A battle once led by the Evim's Legion becomes a triumph of the Imperial Fists. A diplomatic accord once forged by the Aseku becomes an edict from the Emperor himself. The result is not a gap in history, but a seamless lie, crafted so elegantly that only the edges remain frayed. Symbolic annihilation is subtler still. It is the removal of iconography, the defacement of murals, the recarving of monuments. Think of the great statues in the Imperial Palace. 18 plinths, 2 empty. They are not unfilled by accident. They are reminders of erasure, silent and damning. Their emptiness is an admission of violence that cannot be spoken. And yet they remain because total removal would invite too much speculation. A hint must be left, a mystery maintained so that the silence becomes self-reinforcing. There is even a ritualistic aspect to the erasure. Certain prayers and catechisms of the Adeptus Ministorum contain encoded references to the suns cast aside or the twin flames quenched. These phrases are taught without context, accepted without meaning. They are mental scar tissue, spiritual subliminals that simultaneously acknowledge and suppress the truth. The ecclesiarchy does not deny the lost legions. It ritualizes their absence. The very structure of imperial record-keeping aids in this. Every major institution maintains its own archives, its own version of truth. The Schola Progenium, the Administratum, the Mechanicus. Each is encouraged to see its records as complete, even when they contradict. This fragmentation ensures that no one agency can reconstruct the full story. The truth, if it exists, is scattered like ashes in a storm. Perhaps most disturbingly, the Imperium has trained its citizens to fill in the blanks themselves. Human minds abhor a vacuum. When presented with the absence of the Taseku and Afonth, most assume chaos. Others assume betrayal. The truth does not need to be hidden. It simply needs to be absent. The human mind will build its own cage of assumptions and call it history. In this way, the erasure becomes more than historical. It becomes cultural. Psychological, spiritual, a wound so deep it is mistaken for normalcy. The Imperium does not remember the lost legions because it cannot, because it has made itself unable to. The mechanism of forgetting is not just active, it is self-perpetuating. And so the question is not merely what was erased, but what it cost to erase it. What part of the Imperium's soul was burned away in order to maintain this silence? What truths might have saved it if they had been allowed to endure? Even the void cannot remain empty forever. Where the Emperor's historians dared not tread, myth stepped in. The lost legions, forbidden in fact, have become immortal in folklore, madness, and dream. Across the Imperium and beyond, their absence has generated presence, rituals, ghost stories, paintings smeared in blood and ash by artists who claim visions in their sleep. The void they left behind did not remain silent. It sang. There are worlds where the Tu and Evemth are still worshipped, not as traitors, but as saints denied. Hidden cults flourish in the sub-levels of hive cities, in the dark spaces between stars. These believers speak of the weeping suns, or the two who spoke true. They do not name them, but they leave offerings, relics of Astartes' armor painted in colors that match no chapter. They whisper liturgies in half-remembered dialects that no longer exist. Heresy, certainly, but heresy built on memory that refuses to die. In the black ships, some psychers suffer hallucinations of battlefields they have never seen. One inquisitorial report describes a null psychic screaming for days about a legion of light that burned away reality itself. He drew diagrams in his own blood, glyphs unrecognized by any known chapter, yet consistent across several madmen. Another acolyte sketched the same sigil found faintly etched into a ruined vault on a dead world in Segmentum Obscurus, an Ouroboros devouring a flame. Officially, it means nothing. Unofficially, it is impossible. Art reflects the trauma the Imperium denies. In a series of forbidden sculptures uncovered on Luna, two faceless warriors stand among their brothers, eroded, featureless, but taller, somehow grander. The artist was executed, of course, but before his death, he claimed he never saw the faces. He just felt they were missing. In an ancient theater in Hive Dathros, a play is performed in secret, once per decade. The sons whose names burn. No script survives, only the memory of screams, and it is not only the faithful and the mad who remember. Some librarians have dreams they cannot explain, visions of primarchs who do not exist, of battlefields that shift and reform. They wake speaking languages no living soul knows, recounting tactics used in wars not recorded. Some are declared tainted, others vanish. But among their ranks is a quiet understanding. The warp remembers what reality forgets. Even chaos echoes with their absence. The demon primarchs, when questioned in madness or mockery, occasionally gesture to a space that no record should hold. Lorgar once spoke of the brothers who chose silence before lapsing into incoherent prophecy. Perturabo, in a moment of disarmed vulnerability, described a dream where two figures stood before the Emperor's throne and were wept for. These are not statements of treachery, they are statements of mourning. The myths persist because the void cannot endure. Humans create gods out of emptiness, legends out of suppression. The lost legions are more than forgotten, they are haunted. Their legacy is written in shadows, carved into the margins of codices, murmured by those who should not know, felt by those who cannot forget. They are the dream that breaks the prison of sanctioned history, the scream behind the silence. And what does this mean for the Imperium? That for all its power, all its dogma, it cannot kill memory. It can deny, it can punish, but it cannot prevent the soul of mankind from wondering, from mourning, from imagining. The lost legions live on not in records, but in myth. And sometimes myth is more dangerous than truth. What if the silence broke? What if, in the turmoil of the current age, with Guilliman returned, the great rift yawning wide and the galaxy burning with uncertainty, the lost legions emerged once more? Not as relics of the past, but as agents of a new future. This is not idle speculation. It is the kind of heretical thought that keeps inquisitors awake at night and psychers muttering in their sleep. Because the very existence of the lost legions is a test, not just of loyalty but of belief. Imagine a battered warship slipping out of the warp, bearing heraldry unseen for 10,000 years. A primarch, altered by time and pain, steps onto Imperial soil and declares himself loyal to Terra. Not to the High Lords, not to Guilliman, but to the Emperor as he once was. What would the Imperium do? Would it kneel or recoil? Would it execute its forgotten son or crown him anew? The institutions that have ossified over millennia were built on the assumption that such a moment would never come. They would not survive it. The Primaris project, so often lauded as Guilliman's great achievement, would be cast into question. For what if the gene seed used in the Rubicon Primaris bears echoes of the lost legions? What if Call, that ancient calculating techno-savant, knew more than he admitted? What if he has been preparing for their return, not as saviors, but as rivals? The resurgent legions would not slot neatly into the chapter system. They would not obey Guilliman's codex. They would be legions again, in a galaxy that no longer tolerates unity on that scale. Their return would fracture the loyalist ranks. Some chapters would flock to them, drawn by forgotten blood ties or ideological kinship. Others would denounce them as heretics in disguise. Civil war could erupt, not because the lost legions were wrong, but because they were right, and that truth is too dangerous to be allowed. Even more unsettling is the possibility that they have been watching all along, that they never left, that they operate from the galactic fringe, maintaining purity and purpose in exile. Their return would not be a miracle. It would be a reckoning. They would ask hard questions. Why did the Emperor fall? Why was his dream twisted into a machine of worship and stagnation? Why were their names forbidden when the traitors are remembered? And what if they don't return as loyalists? What if they come not with vengeance, but with vision? An alternative to the Imperium, not a rebellion, but a proposal. A post-imperial civilization based on cooperation, reason, and resilience. Heresy, yes, but also hope. In a galaxy drowning in blood, that may be the most dangerous idea of all. The enemies of mankind would not sit idle. The Eldar might see echoes of their own fallen gods in these re-emergent beings. The Tau would seek alliance. Chaos would howl with either rage or anticipation, for if these suns return truly pure, they are threats, and if they return twisted, they are weapons. The eye of terror might widen in welcome, but perhaps the most terrifying thought is this. What if they do not return at all? What if they never will, because they were never gone? Because they are already here, buried in deep cells of the Inquisition, disguised within the Adeptus Mechanicus, folded into the most secretive orders of the Death Watch. Waiting, watching, preserving. And when the stars are right, they will rise, not as conquerors, not as heroes, but as the final question. In the Imperium of man, forgetting is a weapon more potent than any Lascanon. It is precise, surgical, ruthless, and it is never used lightly. The Saku and Affine legions are not simply lost. They were unmade, removed not just from history, but from the hearts of those who once fought beside them. Their memory is not forbidden. It is poisoned. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling revelation of all, that in a galaxy which glorifies death and worships martyrdom, the greatest horror is not to die, but to be forgotten. What sin did they commit that was worse than heresy? What truth did they uncover that was more dangerous than chaos? We do not know. We may never know. But in the act of forgetting them, the Imperium revealed itself. It showed that survival is not built on purity or unity or truth. It is built on control, on silencing those who question, on burying those who refuse, on erasing those whose light is too bright to be shaped. And yet, even now, in every corner of the galaxy, their absence echoes, in rituals that speak of unnumbered brothers, in dreams that show battles that never were, in sculptures with empty spaces where names should be. The silence around them is not empty. It is full of fear, full of grief, full of the terrible knowledge that something beautiful, something terrible, something true was taken from us. Not by enemies, but by those sworn to protect. Perhaps they were flawed. Perhaps they were dangerous. Perhaps they were brilliant beyond imagining. But they were ours. They were sons of the Emperor. They bled and fought and dreamed, just like their brothers. And to deny them remembrance is to deny ourselves. To forget them is to amputate part of our soul. So remember them. Not in name, that was stolen. Not in form, that was shattered. But in silence, in the void between statues, in the empty spaces on banners, in the faint whisper at the edge of prayer. Because to remember them is an act of rebellion. To wonder about them is a flame. To feel for them is to declare, the Imperium may control the past, but it cannot own the future. If you felt this silence, if you've seen the blank plaques and wondered who was stolen, you're not alone. There are others who remember without knowing, who ache for a history that bleeds through the cracks. Join us in seeking it. Join us in imagining what the Imperium cannot admit. And if that truth frightens the galaxy, let it. Subscribe for more forbidden truths, unsanctioned visions, and the lore the High Lords would burn. Because in the dark, in the silence, we remember.